Final Fantasy IV is not the greatest video game ever made. It's not in the top 10 or the top 20. Truthfully, it's not in the top 100. In the year 2020, Final Fantasy IV didn't change my life, and there are dozens of RPGs I'd point a potential game like or two before this one impregnates my conscience. These statements can be true, but this game over the past 29 years has shaped plenty of lives, and is the center of gravity in which all SNES RPGs orbit. This game is one of the ones responsible for our generation falling in love with video games as our medium of choice, as opposed to television. And you can't tell the history of electronic console gaming without Final Fantasy IV. If every RPG on the NES is a Dragon Quest clone, then every RPG on the SNES is a Final Fantasy IV clone. This includes the Dragon Quest games. In fact, one might say that Dragon Quest V was a direct reaction in the same way that the first three Final Fantasies felt like reactions to Enix's series. The first game was basically Square trying to make a better Dragon Quest I, but at the same time, Enix released a sequel with multiple predetermined party members. Square followed suit and released another game aping off Dragon Quest's idea, but again their rival series was one step ahead in introducing a completely customizable party with multiple interchangeable jobs. By the time Final Fantasy III was released, Dragon Quest was already experimenting with non-linear, chapter-based stories about a villain who gets bullied too much. For the record, Dragon Quest IV is one of the 100 best games ever made. But Final Fantasy IV is certainly much cooler, and became much more influential to the future of the genre. This was Square's first Super Nintendo game, and they would go on to be one of, if not the best developers of the era. I've identified 3 things that Final Fantasy IV did exceptionally, and contributed to the advancement of the RPG genre. Intelligent storytelling, the active yet still turn-based battle system, and inventing new ways of combining different structures together. Final Fantasy IV is a Final Fantasy III fanfiction. Credit to Jeremy Parish with that observation. It's a description that is completely and wholly accurate. Square took a similar overall game and filled the blank slates with real characters. Imagine you're playing Final Fantasy III as a kid. You get attached to your team and their jobs, and attach personality traits that aren't in the game. You had to roleplay outside the boundaries of the software. Here in Final Fantasy IV, it's like the storyline you might have filled in yourself, except it's all there in the text this time. I hope what I've previously said about the game doesn't give you the wrong idea. Final Fantasy IV is a great game. With that being said, the plot of this game is undoubtedly garbage that they just made up as they went along. I've previously aided in the defense of garbage, but in this case, it's what keeps a merely great game from being a game of the all-time. For example, when this game runs out of crystals to fight over, they just invent more crystals that were hiding underground, or hiding on the moon, or inside of a whale. Most of the deaths aren't real, and yes, the moon thing is as dumb as it sounds. Also, Golbez being your brother is both unearned and not impactful in the slightest. The plot itself is trite, but what people get wrong about this game, and about most stories in general, is that it's all about the way these things are conveyed. The question of how has always been more important than the what. If you look at literature or film or spoken word, they already had techniques, developed languages, and rules for getting their stories across. Video games in 1991 didn't have such luxuries. Square essentially wrote the textbook by themselves as they made this game. Final Fantasy IV did not have the best story in a video game, but I'll wager that it was the best told story of any game to that point. It feels like a TV drama. The plot points manage to both be episodic, in that every scenario has a distinct beginning, climax, and end. Oftentimes, they even end in a cliffhanger. If you've watched my video about Chrono Cross, you'll know the importance of flow in the Japanese RPG. In order to be effective, the events of the story can't exist independently of one another. Things need to happen because of the thing that happened before. And you don't need to look past the first hour of Final Fantasy IV to see what I'm talking about. At the end of the first hour, you'll find our hero defending a little girl from ruffians in a desert hotel. This isn't an event that just happens because it can. You can follow the breadcrumb trail back to the opening seconds. The ruffians want her dead because the King of Baron wants to genocide her entire race. You know this because Cecil was his messenger of destruction. He became his messenger because he spoke out about waging war and taking these elemental crystals by force. Our hero spoke out against the king because his conscience haunts him from when he murdered peaceful people en route to stealing their crystal. It's impressive how this game manages to string events like this together throughout the entire game. For the first time in series history, Final Fantasy finally beat Dragon Quest to the punch in this regard. And believe it or not, this simple rule you would learn in Screenwriting 101 wasn't thought of before this game. Another thing that works about this game is how much it mixes these enormous stakes with a close-knit, intimate cast of characters. The fates of multiple worlds are in the balance, yet the characters of Final Fantasy IV find the room to exist as people. They come complete with behaviors. They're each already attached to a job class from Final Fantasy III. You don't choose what they say or what they are or what they'll become because they're actual characters, not player avatars. For example, Cecil isn't just a Dark Knight, he's the Dark Knight. People notice and react to his presence, both positively and negatively. There's a kid who is in awe, and an old mage who fears him. Cecil, as the Dark Knight, runs away from his past of pillaging villages for their crystals, and the next boat he gets on after commanding an airship symbolically crashes at sea. After his class change, he accumulates no less than 2 different airships and a spaceship. Cecil is the kind of guy who tells his girlfriend and future queen to leave his bedroom the night before a sobering mission. He's the kind of guy who is willing to accept his rather large demotion from commander to mailman. There are cutscenes where party members speak to one another. Final Fantasy IV is important because it's the first game I can think of where the overall quest comes in second place to the personal quests of every character. Games like Dragon Quest IV and Phantasy Star 2 had characters for sure, but they don't have moments like this. They don't grow or show emotions, really. In those games, it's very much always with an eye towards the greater quest. In this game, you're always in the moment. You don't even know what your end goal is until you're doing it. That probably speaks more to the fact that the developers didn't know what the end goal was until they finished making the game, rather than a clever attempt to misdirect the player. I have a lot more to say about the other characters, and plenty of other great moments, but before I get to that, I need to discuss the combat system. If you found this video, you know what the active time battle system is. But what you might not remember is that in this early iteration, there was no movement bar. It's still there, only hidden. The system changed a turn-based fighting style into a real-time one. What this means is the speed stat no longer only determines who would move first inside of a given round, but how fast a given character can move in total. It's free form, characters can even lap each other. To use a late game example, Edge the Ninja might be able to move 5 times for every 3 Rosa actions. Every other video about this game brings up Formula 1 racing here, and it's an apt comparison. And as a result, oftentimes has the tension and quick movements of a great action game. I'm not interested in discussing the battle system itself, but rather specific examples of the way it's used. There are a number of creative boss encounters, such as this wall. He starts all the way on the left and will slowly make his way across the screen. If he manages to get all the way across, he'll crush and instantly kill the party. This fight makes you want to choose your actions as quickly as possible to deal enough damage to defeat him before it becomes a problem. There's another boss that you will fight as normal at first, but then he pretends to be dead so you'll walk past him and he can attack you from behind, which reverses the position of your party. Even the first boss in the game has a gimmick, where it alternates between states where it's okay to attack and when it's not. There's a 3-pronged boss with these 3 sisters where the dumpiest and least assuming sister turns out to be the linchpin. Things that would later go on to become cliché, but are acceptable here, are the boss rush against the 4 fiends. I like this fight because they lead directly into one another. There's no cutscene or anything in between them. You kill one, and another shows up to take their torch. The final boss has all the friends you made along the way praying for your safety and lending you their energy. What impresses me more than the combat by itself is how the elements of the game fuse in such a natural way. Square makes it seem easy. Previous RPGs, even the ones that I love, treated battles, quests, and characters as disjointed objects. The best part about the active time battle system is how they use it as an active storytelling system. Every character's moveset supports their personality. Edward, for example, is a pussy-ass bitch, so he has the ability to hide, which means that he just leaves the battle. Tella is an old wizard, a mentor who is capable of casting spells that are far beyond what anyone else at this stage of the game is capable of. The trade-off is his stats don't grow nearly as well upon level up, and that he has a hard cap of 90 magic points. Tella's side plot involves him obtaining a spell called Meteo. Once he gets it, it's always in your menu, but it costs 99 MP, 9 more than possible with his character. Later on, in a cutscene the player has no control over, he casts the spell, and it costs him his life. It's a smart death consistent with the game world, and uses the battle system to support his character. The game uses levels to enforce the storytelling as well. When you first begin your adventure, Final Fantasy IV was, and to an extent still is, a breath of fresh air. Here's a game where, instead of starting out as a dweeby-looking child doing 2 damage to a slime, you're a badass knight that starts at level 10 and 200 hit points. I didn't even end the last game I played for this series with 200 hit points. Before the game starts, the protagonist has already been through many trials and tribulations, and again we see this characterization supported by battle mechanics. A lot of the most effective story moments take place on the battlefield. Playing the entire adventure as the Dark Knight was never going to be a reality, so he goes through a class change. In Final Fantasy III, changing classes was just a main course on the menu, but here in 4, it's an event. For Cecil to climb Mount Ordeals and change classes, he needs to rely on these 2 shitty kids to escort him up the mountain. Again, not just in storyline, as Cecil's attacks are ineffective against the monsters on the mountain. He also possesses no healing magic, requiring the services of both a black and a white mage. After staring his old life in the face and not backing down, the descent will see Cecil striking down a zombie and leveling up 4 times because of it. The same monsters that the level 15 Dark Knight could not handle now cower at the sight of a level 1 Paladin. Of course, Rydia's fire phobia is very well documented. You burn her village to the ground, and she quietly doesn't use magic until Rosa moms it out of her. Like magic, she now throws fireballs without hesitation. I could see an indie RPG basing an entire game around this small storyline with Rydia. The infamous Spoony Bard line is not worth someone calling 911 because you screeched bloody murder, but it does take place on the battlefield. In fact, it's a battle scene that takes place completely outside the player's control, which is not an insignificant fact. Instead of 2 sprites ramming into each other and expecting an emotional response from the player, Final Fantasy IV takes you to the battlefield, which is a much more effective tactic. The developers were so proud of it too, that they used it for the final boss. When attempting to talk about something like Final Fantasy IV, which is a game that literally thousands of hours on this website have been devoted to discussing, I can continue and parrot what everyone else has said, so I'll leave sooner rather than later with a few more quick observations. Final Fantasy IV is what Final Fantasy II wanted to be. All the characters represent classes from the previous game. Both games have melodrama and characters that die off. In 2, whoever occupied the 4th slot was always destined to die or leave the party. But 4 keeps a constant rotation of who is in and out of your party. They attempt similar drama, but it hits home in 4 because you can't as easily predict who is coming and going. You do not control who is in your party at any point. People leave and stick with you as their own wants and desires align with Cecil's. For example, when Tella leaves your party, it's not because he and Cecil had a falling out or anything. His goal becomes to learn an ultimate spell, and Cecil's to save Rosa. As they no longer share a common interest, they go their separate ways. Tella does eventually get what he's after, but it has nothing to do with the player. Things happen off screen. The world of Final Fantasy IV does not completely revolve around the player. Characters take action and appear to have their own agencies, Kane being the prime example. When he first leaves the party, he and Cecil were on good terms, but while they were apart, a lot of stuff happened in his life and he switched alliances. Final Fantasy IV would be the game to establish Final Fantasy as the RPG brand in the USA. It's innovative on many fronts and is a game worth remembering. As I continue on with this series, I know for a fact that I will play many better games, but I may not play one that represents the SNES RPG experience more wholly. Thanks for watching, this was Jason Graves, and remember to never trust anyone who needs a haircut.